What a nasty sound. It was the ringing of the alarm clock, which informed the whole room that it was 8 in the morning. With a sharp blow of his hand, the guy turned off the nasty ringing mechanism and slowly began to open his eyes. This is our hero. His name is Stanley, and he had a really bad headache. But not just because of the alarm clock, but because of something else. Getting up from the bed, the guy said that no matter how important the client is, he shouldn't drink so much. It doesn't matter how much alcohol you pour into yourself. What's more important is whether you can close the deal or not. It is also worth remembering that the next day you need to be able to work, because it is simply unbearable to go to work in such a difficult condition. The hero got out of bed, put on his slippers, and suddenly, lowering his feet, he heard the splash of water. Strange situation. Why is the floor wet? Did Stanley forget to turn off the tap yesterday and flood his apartment? He decided to check if the tap was leaking anywhere. After inspecting his apartment, the guy realized that the pipes were fine. The tap was closed. So where did all that water come from? Especially since he lives on the top floor, they couldn't have flooded him from above. He walked over to the window, stretched, and thought that there was nothing valuable in his apartment anyway. He should check the premises first, and the rest could be sorted out after Stanley returned from work. The hero took hold of the curtains and pulled them wide apart to look at the morning sun and the weather outside the window. But what he saw outside the window shocked the guy. It seemed like some kind of terrible dream. His gaze was met with a picture of huge waves covering the buildings and practically flooding all the floors. Sweat of fear flowed from his forehead. He did not understand what was happening and why there was so much water around. It seemed impossible. The entire city was flooded, as if a huge tsunami had swept through the area and plunged the once populated place underwater. Stanley immediately closed his eyes. He tried to rub them and thought that he really had overindulged yesterday. That's why he was seeing things. Opening his eyes slightly and without removing his hands, the guy looked again at the terrible picture. Nothing had changed. The elements were still raging outside the window, and nothing was visible except the ocean and the tops of buildings. The hero stepped back in horror. He realized that this was not a hallucination or a dream, and everything was really happening. Now it is clear why the entire floor in the apartment is wet. But Stanley did not understand how it was possible to get so drunk that he did not notice how the entire city went underwater. The hero decided to check everything thoroughly. The first thing he did was leave his apartment in search of any survivors. "Is anyone home?" Stanley shouted as he reached the door of his neighbors, whom he knew well. The hero knocked more and more on the door, hoping that someone would open it for him and explain what had happened to the world. But no one answered him. Suddenly, the door the guy was knocking on opened by itself. Stanley immediately realized that the door was probably not locked and that he needed to check everything thoroughly. In the neighbor's apartment, the floor was also covered in water. There was no light, and food scraps, sneakers, and other clothes were floating around the apartment. Entering the house, Stanley realized that there was no one there. Even the dog, whose barking once infuriated the hero, had disappeared somewhere. He was still trying to understand what happened, looking at the carelessly scattered food. The hero thought why their city was covered by a flood. Putting together all the pieces of the puzzle he saw in the apartment, Stanley realized that the neighbors, as soon as they found out about what was happening, desperately rushed to run, spilling their noodles, forgetting to put on their shoes and close the door behind them. He was overcome with panic. And because I had slept soundly after drinking, I was left here completely alone, while the others had left the building. But suddenly, the hero looked at his hands, which he placed on the pedestal, and did not believe what he saw. There were his handprints on the nightstand. It couldn't be. If they had escaped yesterday, where could such a thick layer of dust have come from? And how could the food have spoiled so quickly? And in general, is even the most powerful flood capable of inundating an entire city in just half a day? He left the apartment and took out his phone to find any information about it, but there was no connection on the phone. Then the hero tried to call the emergency services and was horrified. The emergency services that always answer did not answer now. He put the phone down. Everything was getting too strange. The flooded city. Dust as if people hadn't been here for a long time and the emergency services not responding. Is our hero the only one left in this city? How is that even possible? But the exhausted guy came to his senses and resolutely clenched his fist. He had no idea what to do, but doing nothing was not his thing. He needed to figure out what was going on here and not get discouraged. The elevator in the building was not working, and our hero lived on the top floor, so the only way to use it was by stairs. But when he opened the door, the guy saw that the stairs to the lower floors were also flooded. Coming closer, he crouched down to look into the thickness of the water. Stanley was surprised that the water was able to reach even here. Reflecting on the flood, the hero touched the water, creating ripples on it that spread further and further. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the sound of water. A couple of meters away from him, the water began to bubble, and it seemed that something was rising to the surface right now. Stanley was overcome with fear. Sweat trickled down his forehead and goosebumps ran down his spine, but he continued to watch the unknown. Suddenly, something appeared from the water that scared the guy, and he abruptly moved away from the water and began to approach the exit from here. The unknown monster rose higher and higher. At first glance, it seemed like it was the girl's hair, but it was quite possible that it was seaweed. The creature rose even higher, and Stanley saw a face. It was a cute girl with closed eyes. He continued to watch her when suddenly the seemingly dead girl began to open her mouth. Ugly teeth and 4 tongues appeared from her mouth, which seemed to want to tear her mouth apart from the inside. Stanley was terrified. The situation was getting worse and worse with every passing second. The girl completely floated to the surface, and she was indeed dead. But her body was somehow strange. If you don't look at the strange tongues, strange petals similar to meat were also sticking out of her chest. The guy's pulse quickened. Panic took over his body when suddenly he realized that it was the girl who lived on the 29th floor. Now the guy was on the 30th floor. He continued to look at the corpse. Despite all the horror, you need to assess the situation in order to at least understand something about what is happening here. He visually examined her body. The corpse was bloated and someone had gnawed her hand. Could these really be some kind of fish? What if these weren't fish, but something much more terrifying? Stanley's imagination was running wild, but he had every reason to think that these were most likely not fish. After all, something else was floating on the lower floors right now and watching the hero, an unknown black substance that was not visible in the thickness of the water. There was no point in staying any longer. He needed to collect everything he needed to survive. Stanley returned to the house, and the first thing he did was collect food. Next, you need to arm yourself with something in case of an attack. The guy took tools from the table that would be useful as weapons and a large cleaver. You also need to stock up on things. Warm clothes so as not to freeze, because who knows what will happen next. And the last thing our survivor needs is a source of fire, matches, a lighter, any paper in the form of notebooks and old books. Stanley decided that he needed to imagine that he was stranded on a desert island with a limited supply of things. As for the escape plan, the hero had a couple of ideas on how to escape from here. As an option, you can stay here and wait for rescue, climb onto the roof and set fire to some junk in order to send a signal with smoke. At the same time, you need to go to the neighbors and see if they have any supplies. And then, as luck would have it, the hero will either be rescued or everything will finally go underwater. Another option is to make a raft for himself. When Stanley uses up 70% of his supplies, he will have no choice but to take a risk and try to get out of here on a raft in search of salvation. To begin with, he decided to choose the first option and make a fire on the roof. Suddenly, helicopters were flying here looking for survivors. There was still a chance for salvation. Having collected several books and textbooks, the guy opened the door, leaving his apartment. He was heading to the roof. Now all that was left was to trust in fate. But suddenly he saw a terrible picture in front of him. In the corridor filled with water, there were someone's footprints that went further down the corridor. The guy panicked again. Maybe I wasn't the only survivor? Someone had climbed the stairs and entered that couple's apartment? But how did they get here if the stairs were flooded? There were too many questions, but the only way to find the answers was to check who entered the apartment. Stanley armed himself with a cleaver and a hammer and decided to do this. Approaching his neighbor's door, he asked if there was anyone alive there. But still, no one answered him. The apartment seemed just as empty and lifeless, but Stanley understood that someone was here. His legs didn't move. He needed to check who was inside, but fear gripped his body. Besides, if it was a person, why wasn't he answering him? Or maybe it was someone else. Suddenly, the hero heard the splash of water and saw a terrible leg that appeared from around the corner of the room. Then the hero saw a disfigured woman who had already become undead, and there was nothing human left of her. The picture was like in a real horror movie. All the guy's fears were confirmed and he was no longer a person. As soon as he realized that things were bad, the monster immediately began moving towards the guy. The wild creature jumped on the stunned Stanley, who froze in place from his panic fear. The zombie knocked the guy to the ground and reached out to bite him and feast on fresh flesh. But the hero did not give up. He kept the monster at a distance, not allowing it to bite him. But the zombie continued its attempts to bite the hero. Up close, he seemed even more terrible than from afar, because one bite and Stanley would be finished. Suddenly, the hero overcame his fear and, shouting, decided to fight for his life to the end. He sharply kicked the scary monster and threw it off himself. The monster flew a couple of meters away from the guy. But upon landing, the zombie immediately gave a push in order to attack again. One quick movement and he was already flying towards Stanley, trying to knock down his victim again. But this time the hero prepared for the attack. He got into a fighting stance to counterattack. As soon as the monster approached the hero, he immediately hit him on the head with a hammer. The blow was powerful, causing the monster to die immediately, and the guy spent a few more seconds recovering from the adrenaline in his body. Trying to catch his breath, Stanley realized that zombies had appeared in the world. Is it possible that this mutation was caused by the flood? Suddenly, the monster glowed blue as if it was dissolving into thin air, which surprised the guy. Suddenly, he heard a system notification that told him that the spirit source was increased. He collected 1 source out of 5. The source of the spirit is one of the 5. What does this mean? What is the source of the spirit? Suddenly, he felt himself being covered by the strange blue aura that had just come from the monster. His body seemed to charge and evolve, emitting blue sparks and concentrating power in the center of the guy's stomach. When it was over, Stanley felt like something had been absorbed into him. Had he really earned a unit of this source by killing that zombie? Apparently, this evolution has an effect on my body. The place where I bruised no longer hurts. The fatigue has disappeared and I seem to feel a kind of surge of energy. The hero swung the hammer, and it seemed to him that even his strength increased and he became much more powerful. But we must not forget about the monster. The guy lowered his gaze and looked at him. He thought what to do with this corpse. He needs to get rid of him. Suddenly he can come back to life or do some other tricks. So the hero takes the dead creature by the leg. He slowly walked towards the stairs, dragging the corpse behind him. While Stanley walked down the corridor, he thought about how this world had changed forever. The evil dead and this mysterious source of the spirit, from the point of view of common sense, it is definitely impossible to explain what is happening. Who knows if the changes that happened to that woman were accidental or inevitable? If all the corpses look like her, then the city has turned into an extremely dangerous place. It was difficult to imagine how many people died in this flood. Perhaps the number of dead was more than 1 million people. Stanley was sure that there was no sign of safety here. He needed to contact the rescuers as soon as possible and get out of here. A few hours later, the hero climbed onto the roof. He collected a bunch of unnecessary junk in order to carry out his first plan. But before doing this, he looked from the roof of the house at the vast water. How large-scale the flood must be for the consequences to be so terrible. The neighboring building also had 30 floors, and the hero wondered if there were survivors like him there. In any case, Stanley decided that he would soon find out. He began to make a fire. The old books and notebooks burned well, and the flame grew bigger and bigger with each sheet of paper. As a result, the guy created a huge fire, the flames of which rose higher than the guy's height. If there are survivors nearby, they may react when they see thick smoke rising from the roof of his house. The black smoke went further and further into the sky. It could be seen for several kilometers. Some time passed and only the coals of burning books remained from the huge fire. Stanley, who was watching this, was upset that no one had come to his aid for half an hour. Apparently, he couldn't count on rescuers. As he was going down the stairs to his apartment, the hero thought that his food supplies would last him 4 days. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a shocking sight. He saw the water touching his feet. Stanley clearly remembered that when he first came here, it didn't reach the 30th floor. So why was the entire span flooded now? Was the water level continuing to rise? This means only one thing. Staying on the 30th floor is also unsafe, so you need to quickly build a raft, because no one knows what fate will prepare for him next. The hero returned to his apartment. He worked hard to create a raft to get out of here as quickly as possible. Made from a few door frames, a bed frame, and a couple of drawers, it should be able to hold up to 300 kilograms. Luckily, Stanley had taken part in boat races in his college years and knew that if he made an oar, he could swim to the next building. After rummaging around in the closet for a bit, he found a clothes hanger that worked well as an oar. But when he came out of the closet, the guy saw a frightening thing again. Right outside the window, there was a zombie corpse floating, showing no signs of life. But no one knows whether it is actually alive or dead. Stanley suggested that maybe not all people turn into zombies, but what if this man could still be saved? While the water level allows, the hero decided to take advantage of this opportunity and test the theory. Attaching a hammer to his coat rack, Stanley opened the window, outside of which the body was floating. The hero carefully decided to pull the man towards himself and extended his oar towards him. Suddenly, the monster woke up and growled, looking with its red eyes at the frightened guy. Stanley realized that he had screwed up. He needed to try to do something so that the zombie wouldn't kill him, and the hero decided to hit him with his oar. He tried to poke the monster's head when suddenly the zombie began to go under the water. What was that? Why did he suddenly start going underwater? Each time, Stanley's guesses frightened him more and more. The zombie was dangling in the water as if resisting some unknown force that was trying to drag him away. But the monster was weaker. After a few seconds, only the creature's legs were visible on the surface of the water. Then he sank completely underwater into the arms of an unknown creature, which was most likely even more dangerous than these dead people. What he saw horrified Stanley. He also realized that besides zombies, there is someone even more terrible, someone who stands at the next step of the food chain of this world. He immediately closed the window. The guy didn't want to face this monster. Stanley was breathing heavily, trying to get over his panic. He needed to do something urgently. Suddenly, the hero remembered that there were also traces of eating on the body of that woman. Perhaps it was the same monster. Stanley slowly slid down the wall and sat in the water. He had been working so hard on the raft, thinking of a way to get out of here as quickly as possible. But the appearance of these two took away all desire from him to try. But staying here is not an option either. There is enough food for a maximum of 4 days, not to mention the fact that the water is rising inexorably. And then there is this undead. Suddenly he heard a roar and loud slamming of hands on the door. Stanley immediately jumped up and grabbed the hammer. As soon as he remembered the undead, they immediately appeared. The hero slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole to see who was behind the door. He saw another mindless corpse knocking on the door in search of food. In addition, the monster had a broken leg, but the hero was not sure whether this would affect his speed of movement. But deciding that this zombie would get to him sooner or later anyway, Stanley decided to attack him first. Opening the door abruptly and taking advantage of the fact that the zombie had his back turned, the hero swung his hammer to break his skull. Hearing the noise, the terrible zombie immediately turned around and saw the hero flying towards him. But it was too late. Stanley's guess was correct, and he was too slow to dodge the attack. Another enemy was defeated. This time, everything went much smoother than last time. A system window suddenly appeared above the guy's head. The same unknown system reported that the source of the spirit has increased and now amounts to 2 points out of 5. Stanley smiled. He seemed to understand how the system worked, and now he should get energy, just like last time. And yes, everything worked out just like last time. The hero was covered in blue energy and felt his strength increase again. In other words, by killing zombies and increasing the value of the spirit source, Stanley becomes stronger. Since his abilities increase, then there is hope to resist the creatures hiding in the water and get out of here. It remains to be seen what this inscription means. 2 sources out of 5. Now the hero has only 2. But what will happen when he collects 5? Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a growl that came from behind him, and such a sharp sound sent shivers through the guy's body. He turned around and immediately remembered the window in the bedroom leading to the street. Stanley turned around and saw a zombie who opened the window and climbed inside his apartment. The ugly smile and eyes filled with rage did not bode well. Another difficult fight lay ahead. Stanley understood how the monster got here, and besides, this creature was clearly superior in strength to those he had encountered before. But the guy had no choice. In any case, he had to kill him. After these words, the hero went on the attack. The monstrous zombie also rushed towards the guy, wanting to feast on his body. Suddenly, the monster grabbed Stanley's arm and stopped his attack. Of the moment, Stanley immediately rushed at the creature. "Die!" the guy shouted. Then, with a powerful blow of the hammer, he hit the zombie on the head, knocking out the last remnants of his sanity. The zombie's eyes turned white. He landed on his back and showed no further signs of life. Covered in sweat from fear, Stanley breathed greedily, trying to catch his breath. His ribs still hurt. But the worst was behind him. A mysterious system appeared above his head again, notifying the guy that he had received a new spirit source point. The blue energy began to gather in the guy's body again, and he realized that this source of spirit had some kind of healing power. The rib no longer hurt and the pain went away. Hearing a rustling sound behind him, the hero thought that if it weren't for this force, he would have definitely died here long ago. After all, right now 2 more zombies climbed into his room. Having heard the crash when the guy fell, if the rib had been broken, it would have definitely been the end for him. The enraged monsters rushed at Stanley, screaming, their faces as disfigured as their previous brethren, with crooked teeth and eyes filled with rage. Since the hero became stronger, he immediately hit the first enemy on the head with a hammer. But due to the large swing, he did not have time to return to his original stance. The zombie took advantage of this and grabbed the guy by the hand. He held Stanley's hand and pushed him further, trying to reach his head. But fortunately for the guy, it wasn't the hand he was holding the hammer in, so the hero immediately raised it above the creature's head. There was a blow, and the last thing the zombie heard in his remaining consciousness was a ringing in his ears. The monster's body immediately went into a stupor, and the immobilized creature fell on its back. 2 more opponents were defeated. Fortunately, they were stupid and not as strong as that monster before them. The system that appeared notified the hero about the successful completion of the task. Now the hero is the owner of the first level spirit source, and to move to the next level, he needs 10 points. A powerful force filled his body. With each monster he killed, Stanley felt himself evolving. The system told the hero that he had two paths of evolution available to him, the stomach and the lungs. Stanley began to consider his choice. He supposed that in this flooded world, increased lung capacity would be a distinct advantage. So he chose the lungs, and at that moment his body vibrated. The system window that appeared said that it was starting to improve the lungs. The hero would receive strong lungs of the first type. A blue ball with unknown energy appeared at chest level, and together with the pain, it penetrated deep into the hero. Blue energy, like little worms, found the lungs and began to penetrate inside them. At one point, the guy's lung contracted and vibrated. Additional growths appeared in it. Evolution was complete. Exhaling, Stanley really felt that the capacity of his lungs had increased compared to what it was before. Now he could hold his breath for at least 3 minutes. Now the guy has hope again. He just needs to upgrade this system so he can survive in this world. And besides, the system was talking about another 10 points, and apparently if the guy gets them, he will be able to get another evolution and increase his chances of survival. Looking at the broken window, Stanley realized that this room was no longer fit for living. Fortunately, the next room was open. He could spend the night there. He picked up the sheet from the floor to use it as a blanket to sleep on. The hero decided that after the next upgrade, he would definitely get out of here. Suddenly, there was a splash of water, as if something had fallen into it. Stanley sank deep into the impenetrable depths. Something was pulling him down. His eyes were closed, and suddenly he heard a voice in his head that told him that he had to become stronger. The hero did not understand what was happening. Was he really drowning, and what kind of voice was speaking to him? As he sank to the bottom, the hero did not yet see how a huge human hand appeared beneath him. Sinking lower and lower, Stanley suddenly felt a solid support, and he realized that he could now stand up. He landed right on this huge hand, and turning around, he saw an even more terrible thing. At the bottom of the sea, in front of him stood an unknown huge figure of a man in a hood who held the guy in his hand. A man of colossal size repeated to the hero that he must become stronger. Suddenly, the hand began to move upward, and Stanley, barely keeping his balance, asked the creature who he was. The mysterious man brought the boy closer to him and said that he had been waiting for him here. 3 minutes passed, and the hero felt like he was starting to suffocate under the water, that he was about to drown. Stanley opened his eyes suddenly. The mysterious man and the deep sea were gone. He got up in the same room, covered with a blanket, breathing heavily. Stanley grabbed his chest and realized that it was just a dream. But suddenly the guy saw in front of him how the room became dark, as if someone's shadow covered the window that was behind the guy. The hero slowly turned around to see what was blocking the sun. What he saw was much more terrifying than the previous zombies and the frightening sea. A huge monster, unlike humans, with a large red eye in the center of its body, looked at the guy from outside the window. He emerged from the water looking like a large mushroom with blisters, one red eye, and a long tongue. Stanley grabbed the hammer. Maybe this is the monster that gnawed the corpse? It seems my only chance to get out of here alive is to kill it. But the guy wasn't sure of his victory until the end. The best option would be to wait, get a couple of sources of spirit, get stronger, and then lure him out and finish him off. But the monster didn't think so. The cracking glass that Stanley heard seriously scared him. An unknown creature was banging its head against the window, trying to break it and eat the guy. Stanley realized that things were bad. He needed to come up with something urgently. He squeezed his hammer tighter in his hand, preparing for an attack. But suddenly, the frog-like monster jumped away from the window and dived back into the water. Then he emerged. Stanley realized what the monster was trying to do. He dives and jumps out, hitting the window, creating powerful shocks and gradually breaking it. So the guy ran to the glass trying to hold it back, and the monster jumped again and hit his head on the window. He was too close to the creature. Fear overcame him. This time, he won't get away with just one broken rib. Then the monster broke through the window frame and tried to climb completely into the apartment. With difficulty rising from the floor, Stanley saw a terrible monster in front of him. At that moment, the guy realized that he was no match for this frog. But the desire to survive was still stronger, so the hero could not think of anything better than to grab onto a nearby table. Lifting the table with his new strength, he threw it towards his enemy. But such an object was not an obstacle for the mutant, so he easily knocked it away with his paw. Turning to the guy, he suddenly noticed that the place where the hero had just been was empty, and he had disappeared somewhere. Meanwhile, Stanley took advantage of the moment and ran into the bathroom, hoping for the cramped space of the room. As if in a horror movie, the hero stood behind the wall and breathed very slowly. His heart was pounding, and he understood that right now an angry frog was looking for him around the apartment. Having sensed its prey, the monster suddenly jumped and broke through the wall in the bathroom trying to catch the guy. But suddenly the monster felt that he was stuck. The guy couldn't hesitate and needed to use this advantage right now. So he swung his cleaver and shouted that trespassing on private property would cost him his life. The guy's cleaver crashed into the monster's eye at great speed. The enraged animal screamed from the hellish pain it felt, its eye bleeding, splashing blood all over the bathtub. After a few minutes, the frog stopped convulsing and became silent. Stanley noticed that its eye color had changed. Apparently, it was finished. But just in case, he needed to make sure that this creature was dead. So the hero, with rage filling him, dealt a few more blows with the cleaver to the creature's head. After a few blows, the guy was sitting on the floor, catching his breath. It was dangerous. If he had made even one mistake, he would have said goodbye to his life. Suddenly, a system message appeared overhead, and for killing this frog, the guy received as many as 8 points of the spirit source. Now the moment of absorption had come. Before this, he had absorbed 1 point at a time, but now 8 at once. The hero had difficulty holding back the energy that was coming to him, but he was able to successfully absorb it all. The hero looked at his hands, which glowed with a blue glow. He realized that his strength had increased again, and it would be much easier to kill this frog now. Suddenly, the hero noticed some strange blue sphere trying to crawl out of the frog's eye. Suddenly, this sphere was released and quickly flew towards the guy like a golf ball. Stanley was scared. What was this? But the ball was flying straight at his forehead. The guy didn't have time to react and dodge, and the blue ball from the frog's body hit him in the forehead and got inside his head. The hero touched the blue glow on his forehead and tried to understand what it was. Was this eye also the source of the spirit? Although it did not look like it. The system reported that the guy received an incomplete peeping rune. His ability allows him to spy on spiritual beasts and obtain basic information about them, and can also evolve to a third eye with unknown abilities. Stanley was happy. Even though he had to take risks, it was worth it. He received not only the source of the spirit, but also a new ability. According to the system, the rune can be used to obtain information about spiritual beasts, and this frog must be such a beast. The boy focused his gaze on the frog and summoned the peeping rune, and at that moment a blue symbol appeared on his forehead. The rune said that this is a cyclops frog, belongs to the elite group of first-level spiritual beasts, feeds on lower corpse animals, has a cruel temperament, will never retreat once it notices its prey, can evolve into the king of cyclops frogs. There is a high probability of obtaining a special skill peeping rune for killing it. After receiving the information, Stanley realized that this frog was an elite monster. But what was the mechanism for increasing the skill of this monster? With each new hour, information about this world amazed the guy. At first, it was a flood that came from nowhere and destroyed the city. Then the appearance of mutated undead, which is also unclear where it came from and how people turn into zombies. A mysterious system that makes the hero stronger for every creature he kills and allows his body to evolve. There are incredible changes happening in the world right now. What was once called common sense no longer matters. Continuing to think about the future, the hero went to the window. He thought that life and death are not toys. So in any case, he must get out and find out what is going on outside. The third day of the flood had arrived. The water was rising higher and higher, and the end of the sea was not visible beyond the horizon. Clutching the hammer tightly in his hands, Stanley said that the rules of this world had changed, and now he needed to get more spirit sources. He walked up to the door behind which he heard a grinding sound and abruptly kicked it down, throwing away the zombie that was standing behind it. He was no longer the same fearful guy. Stanley knew for sure that only by adapting to the new conditions could he survive. He entered the very room where the Cyclops frog was killed and saw several zombies greedily devouring it. The boy focused his vision and summoned a peeping rune to assess the situation. The rune reported that in front of him were walking corpses of a lower rank. They have a certain probability of evolving by devouring their own kind. Stanley prepared his cleaver for the attack. These zombies appeared here just in time because he needs to get 2 more sources of spirit to collect all 10 and become stronger. After these words, the hero suddenly pushed off the floor and ran towards his opponents. He was lightning fast, the system made him stronger, and the first zombies were defeated. The sign above the guy's head said that he had become a first-level medium and had collected 10 spirit source points out of 10. Stanley was glad that he had managed to do this. Now he would get the long-awaited improvement. The guy chose the option responsible for the beginning of evolution, and his body began to be covered with a blue aura. Soon the system reported that the improvement was complete. To become a second-level medium, you will need to collect 20 sources of spirit. Now the hero can strengthen the first-type lungs, stomach, and his muscles. Stanley was analyzing what would be better to take. With reinforced lungs, I would be able to hold my breath for at least 4 minutes. However, in the water, I could encounter something damn terrible, and they would be of no use. So the best option would be to strengthen your muscles. Making his choice, he hit the system window with a hammer. The system reported that Stanley was receiving basic strengthening, an increase in muscle mass of the first type. Muscles are strengthened, strength increases, the ability to control muscles improves, their strength increases. He felt the power of the system penetrating his body. It was a painful process, just like with his lungs. At that very moment, the guy felt his arms, legs, and torso begin to swell and expand. His muscles strengthened, and he began to look like an athlete. Now Stanley felt much better, more powerful, and faster. This feeling amazed him. The large amount of muscle caused the clothes on his body to tear. Now his strength had increased significantly, as had his ability to control his own body. He could feel every muscle in his body. Now he could use this skill for defense. It was time to try it out, Stanley said, throwing the hammer into the air. Firmly grasping the hammer that had fallen into his hand, the boy prepared to attack his first target, who was already running towards him. One hit and the zombie's face became deformed and all his teeth flew out. The hero was surprised at how far the monster had flown, and even so he could barely calculate his strength and barely stayed on his feet. But this power made him happy. He understood that he was now capable of more than before. Stanley began to cut up the monsters that were in the room. The lower zombies were pretty stupid and it wasn't difficult. Little by little he began to get used to the force of the blow, concentrated it on his legs and arms, and each time it became easier to control his body. The monsters could do nothing against him, and after each blow to the guy's head with his small hammer, they died. The last zombie fell dead at the guy's feet. All opponents were defeated. Stanley looked at his goals and rejoiced at the power he had gained. The evolution test had been successful. However, there was one detail that seemed strange. The system window did not appear, which meant that for the first time he did not receive the spirit source for these creatures. Stanley exhaled and said, "Well, okay, the level of these creatures is not high enough anyway. That was probably the issue. Luckily, I have a second-level spirit source, so it's time to step out of the shadows and stop hoping for anything. Today, I'll build a raft and get out of here." After a few hours, the homemade hanger sank into the water. The hero collected all his remaining things and headed towards the neighboring house. The guy finished his raft and could now move on the water. He took with him several sources of fire, the remaining food and clothes. As he approached the neighboring house, Stanley thought that this distance of a couple of dozen meters was seriously frightening. He wrapped a rope around a brick in case he missed and threw it through the window of the house. But there was no need to get it out. The hero successfully knocked out the window with the first hit of the brick. Armed with his usual weapon in case of attack, he approached the window because no one knows what awaits him inside. Looking through the window and assessing the situation, Stanley realized that there seemed to be no danger in this room. He climbed through the window and made his way inside the apartment, splashing water. Running his hand over the table, the hero noticed that there was the same thick layer of dust here as his neighbors. Apparently, no one had cleaned here for a long time. Having prepared his hammer, he gradually began to make his way deeper into the house. There was danger lurking around every corner, so Stanley carefully and slowly opened the door. But it seemed that no one had lived here for a long time, because the smell was musty and there was not a single sound. The first thing to do is to get supplies. The guy opened the refrigerator door, but unfortunately all the food had long since gone bad. Looking deep into the refrigerator, Stanley hoped that people had managed to get out alive. Suddenly he smelled the smell of blood coming from the next door. Apparently there are zombies there, but in any case, the room needs to be checked. So Stanley moved closer to the scary door. The hero abruptly opened the door and prepared to attack, but no one attacked him. After all the zombies that were behind this door were dead, which was quite strange. Stanley realized that all the people had turned into walking dead, but then they were killed. But who could have done that? Maybe there were survivors like him hiding somewhere here. So, just in case, the hero decided to check the room with the help of a peeping rune. As he passed by, he only saw a sign that said that the creatures were dead. Stanley thought that since this man managed to defeat so many dead people, he must also be a carrier of the spirit source. But the guy was not sure if this man was here. Having reached the nearest door, Stanley began to knock on it and shout if anyone was alive. Suddenly, looking around, the hero saw something that the system had highlighted for him. There was a key lying on the floor near the door that might fit it. The guy picked it up from the floor and inserted it into the keyhole. He noticed that the key was the same as his from his past life, which seemed to be a long time ago. The key fit, and Stanley opened the door. Entering the room, he saw a man on the floor who did not look like the zombies he had seen earlier. Looking at the bat the man was holding, he assumed that the man had used it to deal with all the undead in the previous room. After scanning the man, the system said that he was not a walking corpse like the previous bodies the guy had seen. But it seems that a stronger monster appeared here, like that giant frog, and tore him apart with its sharp claws. Perhaps if Stanley had arrived earlier, he would have managed to save him. In any case, the past cannot be returned. The guy decided to inherit the weapon with which the man fought. Suddenly, a rune on his forehead reacted, telling him that there was someone else in this room. He heard rustling in the closet. Stanley immediately went to it to check what was there. There could be anything there. Perhaps the same monster that killed the man was sitting inside. So the hero carefully began to open the cabinet door, holding the bat at the ready. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead. Fear gripped him. The hero swallowed the lump in his throat, but he needed to check what was inside. There was no choice. The guy suddenly pulled the handle of the cabinet and picked up his bat. But what he saw shocked him. In the corner of the closet, under the clothes, sat a little girl who looked at the hero with confusion.